Doing a daily Bible devotional has been the best thing that I've done for myself. My time in the Old Testament only proves to me again and again and again that the heart of man is deceitfully wicked above all things. When I'm reading the New Testament, I read it within the context of when Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Everything in the New Testament is just an expansion of one of those two thoughts. Those are the two lenses through which I think with my mouth open as I read through the Old and New Testaments. Join me, won't you, for another adventure in Coffee, the Bible, and Page. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Page. I am your caffeine-imbued host, Paige. Here's my coffee. Say it with me. In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. And it still is good. Well, I apologize for skipping a devotion yesterday, but I had some technology issues, of which I have taken care of. And I'm kind of laughing at it because sometimes the simplest solution is the best. I have these USB podcast type cameras that I've been using and been wrestling with them and not really totally happy with the quality of it. And then I remembered, I have an iPhone, relatively new iPhone that's got great camera. Let's try that out. And wouldn't you know it, here we are. So sometimes the simplest solution is the best. Having said that, let me bring you up to speed on what's going on here with David. David has fought Goliath, and David has been invited into the king's court, Saul's court. He plays the liar for him on occasion when Saul's having a tough time. In fact, Saul's, he's starting to lose his mind. He has a spirit from God, descent from God, that is harming him because he's rejected God. He's disobeyed God. And the minute Samuel chewed him out for it, he pretty much went whole hog away from God. So he's actually starting to lose his mind. And during his bouts of insanity, David plays the harp and it calms his spirit. So David's been coming and going a little bit at a time. But I wanted to establish some kind of a timeline, because this is a lot of times when these stories are told in the Old Testament, especially, even in the New Testament for that matter, when biographical information is shared, it's time compressed. You get the feeling like this all happened one thing after another, one thing after another. In truth, that's not true. So let's take a look at David's timeline here. Here we go. Here we are. Let's see. There we are. As you can see here, we've got, number one, David was 13 to 15 years old when he killed Goliath. He was a boy. He was a teenager. He wasn't old enough to be in the army. That's why he was home tending the sheep. His older brothers were old enough to be in the army, because you had to be a minimum age of 20 years old to serve in the army, according to Numbers 1:3. So he kills Goliath, but he's not staying with Saul the whole time. He's still going home tend the sheep because, he's not old enough. And it says, though, in the last chapter we read, in chapter 18, that he was given high rank in Saul's army. Well, that means he must have been 20 years old. So when we read in 18:5 where he was given a high rank, he was of age, he was serving in Saul's army. And then in 2 Samuel 5:4, it states that David was 30 years old when he became king of Israel. And there's going to be a period of time of getting ready to cover, starting with this chapter, where David is on the run from Saul, and he has to hide from Saul. And this is the last period of Saul's reign, and it is the period just before David becomes king. David becomes king when he's 30 years old. In 2 Samuel 5:4, it says David was 30 years old and became king. Starting in today's chapter, for the next 6 or 7 years, David is going to be fleeing from Saul. He's going to be a refugee. He's going to be an outlaw. So that's the time frame we're dealing with. David, as a 20-year-old young general, has been just racking up the victories. Saul is now beginning to hate him, and that's where we are with today's chapter 19. That brings you up to speed. Now, I'm going to come back a little bit later and talk about this timeline and apply it, because that's honestly where God took me when I was doing my devotional on this, the timeline issue of my life. David was probably maybe 12, perhaps, when Samuel came to his house and anointed him to be the future king of Israel. So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. Let's look at chapter 19. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning and go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and I'll stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and I will tell you what I find out." Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He hasn't wronged you, and what he's done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took his oath. "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Now, once more, the war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in the house with the spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. And when Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he's ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told him, "Bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him." But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, "Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped?" Michal told him, "He said to me, 'Let me get away. Why should I kill you?'" When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. And word came to Saul, "David is in Naioth at Ramah." So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku, and he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" "Over Naioth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. That's why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" From this day forward, David becomes an outlaw. Now, here's where God took me with all this. I was thinking of David's timeline. He was anointed to be the king of Israel by Samuel at 12 or 13 years of age. Shortly thereafter, he goes and he kills Goliath. And Saul brings him into his court to play lyre for him. And he's been playing lyre. And it's because when Saul's beginning to lose his mind, the music soothes him. But when David becomes 20 years old and he actually becomes a general in Saul's army, he starts having these fantastic battlefield victories. And people are celebrating him, and Saul is getting jealous. Saul is losing his mind. Like I said, he's going insane. And in his insanity, he keeps trying to kill David. And the scene that's described here, where David is playing lyre for him, and it says he takes a spear and tries to impale him, tries to pin him to the wall. Think about how frightening that must have been. Saul was a large man. He was a big man, powerful man. And the picture I get in my head isn't that he threw the spear at him. I get the feeling like he charged at him, ran at him with the spear to pin him to the wall. Think of how frightening that must have been for David. Even if Saul threw the spear, that would be frightening. But in my mind's eye, I'm picturing David looking up to see this madman coming at him with the spear. That had to be the most frightening thing ever. But I digress. Here's where I was going with this. David was anointed to be king of Israel when he was 12, 13 years of age. But he didn't become king until he was 18. And in between the time he was anointed to be king and the time he became king, think of all the things that happened. First of all, he kills Goliath. Then he becomes a very successful general. He's rising to the top. He even marries Saul's daughter. So he's the king's son-in-law. I mean, you think, all right, he's on path. He's on the path. Then all of a sudden, Saul begins to lose his mind and seeks to kill David. And it gets to the point where David can't even live with his wife anymore. He has to run and he has to hide. And then for 7 to 10 years, he's hiding from the king of Israel, who's going to be actively searching for him. And then when Saul finally dies and David finally becomes king, he's 30 years old. Here's a statement I want you to remember. Sometimes the time between the annunciation of an event and the realization of that event can be significant. For David, 13 years. Think about Moses. He was destined to become the leader of Israel, but only after he spent 40 years in isolation in the wilderness himself as a shepherd. Think about Paul. He meets Jesus on the road to Damascus and starts preaching up a storm, causes a huge amount of trouble, and the disciples hide him and sneak him out of the city, and then he goes home to Tarsus for the next 14, 15 years. And nobody hears of him until Barnabas goes and gets him. Paul would later on say that Jesus had told him what his ministry was going to be. But there's 14 or 15 years in anonymity. David, anointed king, kills a giant, becomes a successful general, and then the king loses his mind and chases him out. And it's going to be another 10 years, a total of 17 years from the time he was anointed king of Israel to the time he actually became king of Israel. 17 years. Sometimes there is a large chunk of time between the annunciation of an event and the realization of that event. It happened to me when I first bowed my knee to God in boot camp, Easter service, March 1975. Yeah, March 1975. I heard Jesus say, and it was almost as if it was a spoken voice. It was that real to me. Those of you who've had experiences with God like that, you know what I'm talking about. There wasn't a disembodied voice echoing through the hall. I heard it in my head, but it was as if he was standing right next to me, and I heard him say, I have a ministry for you. All right, that was the Annunciation. So I assumed I was going to be a preacher or a worship pastor. Back then we called it ministers of music. Remember, this is the 70s. And so I set out to become one of those two things. And it never happened. It never happened. God shut the door dramatically in so many instances. And I was really, really, really puzzled. God, you said you have ministry for me. What's it supposed to be? My spiritual gifts, every time I took a spiritual gifts test, was teaching, administration, and prophecy. I'm thinking to myself, well, that qualifies me to be a preacher or a worship pastor, to run a church, to run a music ministry. But it never happened. And another long story for another time, how I came to the point where I finally realized I was not going to be a pastor and I was not going to be a minister of music. It took me almost 15, 16 years to realize that. But I still didn't know what I was going to be. And I became an engineer, and I ended up getting fired from my engineering job. And it was about the time of 9/11 hit, and everything in the world was upside down and sideways. And I started teaching guitar just to make $1 or $2 so I could keep the mortgage paid, because if we could manage to hang on to the house long enough to sell it, then we could pay off most of the bankruptcy payments, which we did. But I started teaching guitar, and then, surprise, surprise, I found out I really liked teaching guitar, and I was pretty good at it. Caught me by surprise, to be honest. And things started to snowball. I started to get more and more students. I got connected into the homeschool community here in Metro Atlanta area, and started to earn a really decent living as a music teacher at various co-ops, private schools, things of that nature. And but still, in the back of my head, I'm wondering, God, you said I have ministry. What? Glenda and I were discussing this once, and I got to tell you something about this wife of mine. She has discernment like nobody I've ever seen. And she has an old-fashioned, feet planted firmly on the earth wisdom about her that is so necessary to me, and it's wonderful to see it in operation. We were talking about this ministry, and she said, well, I'm curious, what are your ministry gifts again? And I told her, teaching, administration, prophecy. She said, okay. How many of the kids that you're teaching in your music classes and lessons, how many of them are Christians? I said, almost all of them, if not all of them. She said, okay. Is it safe to say you're teaching the next generation of worshiper believers? I could see where she was going. I said, yeah. And administration, let's see, are you scheduling lessons, booking lessons, canceling lessons, receiving money, paying bills? I said, yeah. Administration. She says, then are you speaking God's mind into the lives of your students whenever you get a chance? I said, yes. Because a lot of my students, I'm like a grandpa to them. I'm a Dutch uncle, sometimes a dad, a friend. And every chance I get, I try to speak God's word into their lives. She says, well, sweetheart, that's prophecy. She said, I got to tell you, you're in the ministry. You are doing what God has called you to do. The funny thing is, you've been doing it for the past 10 years and didn't even know it. She was right. This is what God has called me to do. This is what God has called me to be. This is the fulfillment of that thing he told me in 1975, and I didn't start into that ministry he had for me until about 2002. So for the last 21 years, I've been doing what God designed me to do and be. But he told me about it in 1975. David was told he was going to be king of Israel when he was 12 or 13. He didn't become king until he was 30. 18 years. And the last period of time before he became king was his darkest time, where, as you're going to find out, he was on the run. He was an outlaw. He had a death sentence hanging over his head. Saul, the king of Israel, was going to bring everything he had at his power to bear in capturing and killing David. And you had to imagine if during that time David wondered if he and Samuel had heard God right when Samuel said, you're going to be the next king. But here's the point. Though there is many times a space between the enunciation of the event and the realization of that event. The end result is that thing that God promised comes to pass. I've said this before. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, I don't have it here with me. Pretend you're the author of a book. All right, and let's say there's 30 chapters in that book. You, as the author of this book, you know the beginning, middle, and end all at once. It's all now to you. But the characters in that book are moving forward through their story a page at a time. And they're in chapter 1, and they don't know what chapter 5 holds for them. They don't know that when they get to chapter 30, that everything is glorious and wonderful, and that things have worked out exactly as the author of their story said it would. We're living our story a page at a time, a day at a time, and sometimes it seems like God is slow. He promised me in 1975 that I'd have a ministry, and I wasn't put into that ministry until 2002, 27 years later. Paul says when he writes in his epistles, he says that he knew what God had for him when Jesus spoke to him in Damascus. But he didn't start doing it for another 14 or 15 years. David was told he's going to be king when he was 12. He didn't get to be king until he was 18. Moses, leader of Israel, 40 years in the wilderness being prepared for what God was going to unleash him on the world to do. Noah spent 100 years working on the ark. 100 years between the time that God told him what was going to happen and the event actually happening. Makes sense? Do you see how that works? That's what's getting ready to happen with David. David is getting ready to enter the darkest period of his life. And out of this darkest period of his life are going to come so many psalms, are going to come so much. He is going to become tempered, and he's going to become the man after God's own heart in the trials he's about ready to go through. If I had tried to become a guitar teacher when God first told me that he had ministry for me, I wouldn't have been successful. I wasn't ready. You know what made me a good guitar teacher? Desperation and terror. There was no work for me. Being a guitar teacher was not my first choice. I went from a 6-figure salary to nothing overnight. I had to go through everything I went through in my life to turn me into the type of person that could be an effective teacher for his students. So, that's where God took me with all this. If there's a word here to be shared with you, it's just sometimes between the enunciation of an event and the realization of an event, there's a huge period of time in between. God is not so concerned about time as we are. We're slaves of time. I'm in chapter 67 of the story that God has written in my life. I'm 67 years old. I'm in chapter 67. There might be another 23 chapters to go. It might be 33 chapters to go. This might be a 100-chapter book that God's writing in the life of Paige. It might be only a 68-chapter book on the life of Paige. I don't know. God does. And I'm going to leave that in his hands. All I know is this. He told me he had ministry for me in 1975, and I stepped into that ministry in 2002. And it was right, and it was perfect, and it was great. All right, that's enough for today. Here's Paige. There's my coffee again. You folks have yourself a wonderful, fabulous day. I'm out of here. Bye-bye. So, what did you think about today's Bible devotional? Email me and let me know your thoughts at ffog@me.com.